today I'm going to be talking about various different relations between philosophy and history, and I'm going to be covering both the history of philosophy and the philosophy of history to some extent. And I will certainly discuss the relation between philosophy and its history, and whether Hegel was correct or not. So the first point I want to make is that the kinds of questions which philosophy starts from are driven by ordinary curiosity, the kind of curiosity that most people have, at least when they're children. Those questions are mostly not questions about history. They're questions like, for example, what is fairness, what is knowledge, and maybe what is time, questions of that kind. And they are not intended as questions about history or about the history of philosophy. They're just straightforward philosophical questions, however complicated it may be to answer them, about things like fairness, knowledge, time, and so on. And so from that starting point, philosophy is not a historical study. At least most of the questions that it's concerned with are not historical questions.
Sorry, Williamson. Sorry to interrupt. Can you share your screen? Can you share your screen?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Some audience
yes,
cannot
sorry.
see your slides.
Yeah. Just a minute.
Sorry for interruption.
I have to go back, I think. Yes, I'm sorry about that. I was seeing my own screen, but yes. So I was just making the point that the curiosity-driven kinds of question that philosophy starts from are mostly not questions about history. And I think it's also true to say that most prominent philosophers of the past were mostly not asking questions about history. And I think that's true not just of the Western tradition, but of other traditions as well, as far as I can tell. That questions like what is fairness are questions that philosophers have been interested in from all sorts of traditions, and are not historical questions. So, of course, Hegel is a famous exception to that. And he did identify philosophy with the history of philosophy in some sense, and that identification, as Chambo was saying when he introduced this talk, has been very influential. Certainly, when I was giving a lecture at Moscow State University a few years ago, and I was asked, did I agree that philosophy is a historical discipline? And when I said no, I could see that the person who'd asked me was very disappointed. And so some of my reasons for that negative answer will emerge in the course of this lecture. But I think Certainly within the analytic tradition, the identification of philosophy with its history, or of the kind of study of philosophy with the study of the history of philosophy, has generally been rejected. There are one or two exceptions, so that, for example, Robert Brandom at Pittsburgh, he accepts some version of that Hegelian identification, but I think that's very much a minority view within analytic philosophy. So I will say some things about the philosophy of history now, because, of course, just by definition, the philosophy of history is concerned with asking questions about history. And in that sense, it's different from most of what philosophy is concerned with. So in analytic philosophy, the kinds of questions that are asked in philosophy of history are mostly questions about history in the sense of the study of actual past human actions. In other words, historiography. They're not questions about the actual past human actions themselves, but rather about how we are able to understand what these actions were and what they were intended to achieve, and so on. Why they were these actions were taken. So I think, the reason why, at least in this perspective, there's skepticism about why the philosophy of history, as it tends to be done, at least within the analytic tradition, tends to be the study of the past human actions and not the study of the past human actions themselves, is that the skepticism as to whether the topic of actual past human actions, as it were, in general, at a philosophical level, is demarcated in a way that's appropriate for abstract philosophical reflection. I think the suspicion is that the course of history is, as it were, too, in some broad sense, too accidental to be an appropriate object of philosophical study in itself, that the kinds of patterns that one might perceive in it are not at the kind of level of generality that philosophers are typically interested in. And I think not many analytic philosophers would think of history as a whole, the actual course of human life over time at a general level as having some kind of philosophical meaning at all. It just, as it were, it just happens. Of course, metaphysicians are interested in the past, and they even ask questions like whether the past exists or whether it's only the present that exists. But that's not really philosophy of history, because it's, in asking such questions, it's not just asking about past human actions, it's asking about all past events whatsoever. And it's asking about them at a level of generality so great that it's not intended to have any special repercussions for the philosophy of history. And if one's thinking about how other branches of philosophy impinge on history, one could think of philosophy of mind and epistemology, because philosophers of mind and epistemologists are interested in things like memory and testimony, which of course are crucial to our knowledge of the past. But again, the kind of interest that those philosophers have in memory and testimony is much too general to count as specifically the philosophy of history. And just continuing this theme for a moment, that moral philosophers and philosophers of law are interested in specific questions about past actions, about our responsibility for our past actions. But again, in too general a way and too moralizing a way, in fact, to count as philosophy of history. So because of that, the philosophy of history in either sense is actually a very small branch of contemporary analytic philosophy. I mean, there are very few people who do it. I think maybe it's been somewhat neglected, perhaps because of the rather sort of natural science-oriented direction of a lot of analytic philosophy, and one might feel even that it's due for a revival, but it's not likely to become central to philosophy, at least as understood within the analytic tradition. It's likely just to be one of many branches of philosophy that studies particular kinds of inquiry into the world, in this case, historical inquiry. Now, of course, if we're looking at the question of the relation between philosophy and history, even given that philosophical questions are not, in many cases, or in most cases, are not questions about the history of anything, history may still provide relevant evidence as to what the correct answers are. And I think one natural example about that is from political philosophy, where it seems pretty reasonable to test theories in political philosophy about how a human society should be organized by asking how how societies that were organized, at least in some approximation to such theories, how they've in fact fared, what's happened, whether they were a success. So, I mean, of course, it's never the case that any actual human society perfectly exemplifies any theory in political philosophy, but some come a lot closer than others, and so they do provide some kind of information about whether a certain view as to how society should be organized is credible or not, by how at least doing something like similar to exemplifying that theory, how it's in fact works in practice. But if we're talking about the relation between history and philosophy, of course, one aspect of that is simply that the history of philosophy is part of history. And in particular, past philosophy is part of past human action. I mean, writing books, after all, is an action. So, of course, the history of philosophy, in principle, has some role within history. I mean, within the study of history. And when it's thought of that way, it's typically subsumed as part of the history of ideas. That's the sort of phrase that is used when historians are studying the history of philosophy. And obviously, this is an entirely legitimate part of history. And naturally, it's not a completely isolated part, because the history of ideas has consequences for the rest of history, because ideas have consequences, or at least people's acceptance of those ideas has consequences. And so one kind of example one can think about is what the political effect of the idea of human rights. I mean, the idea of human rights is one which came from philosophy, from philosophers like John Locke and others, and it's had some effect on politics when people have believed in such ideas, and it had some relation to the American and French revolutions, for example, not to mention more recent politics. I mean, exactly what the relation was is itself a matter for historical investigation. But it is the case that that philosophical ideas sometimes have very large repercussions, and of course, the case of Marxism is an example of that. And in the case of China, Confucian philosophy has, I think, clearly had an important effect on the history of China, and it's something that, in order to have a full understanding of the history of China, which I certainly do not have, but I take it that one would need to understand something about the effect of Confucian philosophy as part of such a full understanding. So, the history of philosophy is important for history in those kind of ways. But if we're looking at the study of the history of philosophy in itself, without considering what its repercussions have been for wider history, I certainly would agree that studying the history of philosophy has value for its own sake, and that the great works of philosophy, I mean, they're great cultural monuments, even if the philosophy in them is wrong. Like, for example, great temples, maybe temples of a religion that no one follows anymore, but these are still, in some sense, great achievements of the human spirit, and deserve to be studied for that reason. So one doesn't have to think that a philosophy is true in order to think that it's worth at least some study. So in the rest of the lecture, I'm going to be focusing on the relation between philosophy and the history of philosophy, which is corresponds to the title of the lecture. And in order to keep things manageable, I'm going to be asking two questions, which it's important to distinguish. So one is, what does philosophy contribute to the history of philosophy? And the other is, what does the history of philosophy contribute to philosophy? Of course, if you think there's no difference between them, then in effect, these are both asking, what does philosophy contribute to itself? But if we don't take for granted that philosophy is the same thing as the history of philosophy, and I've already suggested that equation it simply doesn't fit a lot of philosophy, that that we should separate these questions because they're not asking the same thing. I mean, I guess, you know, if you somehow thought that that philosophy had, as it were, come to an end, that all philosophical questions had been satisfactorily answered, and all the objections to those answered had been dealt with, and there were no more, and so there was nothing left for philosophy to do, then maybe there wouldn't be very much more than for us to do than the history of philosophy. But I think it's quite clear, if you follow what goes on in contemporary philosophy, that there are many questions in philosophy that we don't know the answers to. In fact, it might be that for most philosophical questions, we don't yet know the answer. So one way of clarifying, and as it were, to some extent operationalizing those two questions about the relation between philosophy and the history of philosophy is by putting them in the following form, or at least asking the following closely related questions. So corresponding to the question, what does philosophy contribute to the history of philosophy? There's the question, how good a philosopher must you be to be a good historian of philosophy? And corresponding to the question, what does history of philosophy contribute to philosophy? There's a corresponding question, how good a historian of philosophy must you be to be a good philosopher? And so I'm going to spend quite a lot of time thinking and talking about those latter two questions that I've labeled A star and B star. And so I'm going to begin by discussing the question, how good a philosopher must you be to be a good historian of philosophy? So when you study some past philosopher, it doesn't matter who it is, I'm calling them X, you need to understand what X says. And in that way, you need to understand some philosophy. But it seems that you don't need to know whether what X says is true. But you could understand what they're saying without knowing whether it's true. Now, if this past philosopher that you're interested in argues for something, you need to understand what X's argument is if you're studying that philosopher. But perhaps you don't need to know whether the argument is valid or not. But I would be a bit cautious there. So one kind of extreme analogy that one might make is that you don't need to be a good footballer to be a good historian of football. I mean, you could be someone who was unable to kick a ball and still be a good historian of football. And so one extreme model of the relation between philosophy and the history of philosophy is that it's similar to the relation between football and the history of football. So, I mean, skill at football and skill at the history of football are completely different things. That's probably too extreme in the case of philosophy. Now, let's think a bit about why. So if that extreme analogy with football was correct, then the history of philosophy could be left to historians rather than philosophers. Because if that analogy was correct, no special philosophical skill would be needed in order to do the history of philosophy. As it were, you just needed to be well acquainted with whatever philosophical ideas people had in the past, however crazy those ideas were. Now, one thing that historians will be good at in relation to philosophy typically is that they'll be good at supplying the cultural context of past philosophy, as it were, how people became philosophers in the past, what the life of a philosopher involved, and how philosophy was related to other aspects of culture at the time, and so on and so forth. But in practice, if the history of philosophy is written by historians, there is a danger that it will be emptied of philosophical interest. So an example of that is the way that medieval European philosophy, the philosophy of the scholastics, used to be studied in a very historically oriented way. And this is not my field, but I as a philosopher with some interest in metaphysics, I would sometimes try to find out what one of the great medieval philosophers like William of Ockham or someone, what he'd thought about some question. And so I tried consulting the books, which have mostly been written by people who were not philosophers, but were studying medieval philosophy as historians. And it was impossible to make any sense any philosophical sense of what they were describing as the views of these medieval philosophers. Really what they were doing was not much more than just, in the most literal possible way, turning the Latin that they'd written into English, but English which was practically meaningless. It was clear to me that the people who were writing this thing were not philosophers. They did not know how to make philosophy intelligible. So, I mean, although this hardly needs to be said, I mean, to understand the work of past philosophers, it's not enough to be able to remember their words or even to remember a literal translation of them into your own language. That understanding an old text requires interpreting it, in particular, choosing between alternative interpretations of it. And of course, this applies very often even in understanding contemporary philosophy, that it's often quite hard to work out what a contemporary philosopher is saying in one of their new texts. And that often one has to try to work out which of several alternative interpretations of it is correct. But this applies even more, I mean, to the understanding of an old text, which is written using philosophical terminology that most of us are no longer familiar with, and written on assumptions that we may not be familiar with. But choosing between alternative interpretations, that requires working out which of them makes the most philosophical sense, which of them, as it were, maximizes the coherence, the cogency, the plausibility, and so on, of what the past philosopher is saying, because if we didn't have criteria like that, which broadly speaking we can subsume under the terminology of a principle of charity in interpretation. If we didn't use charity in interpretation, it would often be we wouldn't be able to work out which of several competing interpretations was right. And something that I think even the historians of philosophy, coming at it from the most historical point of view, concede is that the past philosophers were pretty intelligent, and so if we attribute to them ideas which are just radically confused, we're probably misinterpreting them. I mean, it's not certain. I mean, because it's very difficult to avoid confusion in philosophy. But on the whole, interpretations which make the text good philosophy are more plausible than those which make it bad philosophy. And the criteria for distinguishing between good philosophy and bad philosophy, although of course they do to some extent change over time, but we're working in our own time, and we've got to make sense of what these people are saying. And if we end up attributing to them a view which is pretty close to nonsense, then it's very likely that we've got them wrong. And after all, if they were talking something close to nonsense, I mean, there might be some reason to study them, because, as it were, even the history of nonsense is history. But there wouldn't be anything like as much reason for studying them as there is if what they say makes good sense. And so I think some kind of principle of charity in interpretation, exactly to what extent it's applied, but some such principle is really non-negotiable. We just can't manage without it, because we just won't have the ability to choose between different interpretations without it. And so to apply a principle of charity in interpretation, you need a good training in philosophy. You need to be able to think philosophically, to understand what coheres together and what doesn't. And of course, I mean, if it were the case that even with such a philosophical training, the ideas still couldn't make any sense, then it might be difficult really to achieve any stable interpretation of them. But I think experience shows that people with a good training in philosophy often can make sense of these past texts and reveal them without too much, as it were, distortion of the text. Reveal them as containing all sorts of interesting and clever philosophical ideas, and maybe wise philosophical ideas, and cogent arguments, and so on. And I think once we've got an interpretation that's respectful of the text, but also makes philosophical sense of it, then that's far more likely to be correct than one which makes very little philosophical sense. And so we get retrospective support for the need for this kind of training in philosophy to produce plausible interpretations of past philosophical texts. And I mean, I'm not a historian of philosophy, but when I hear people who do have a philosophical training about past philosophical texts. It's sometimes a wonderful experience to hear how they can make something that initially seems totally obscure, how they can explain what's going on in it in such a way that one can see that this text involves a very, very smart philosopher making some very clever and sensible moves within the intellectual framework that they're using, and that one can see the kind of philosophical skill that was being used that is still recognizable as philosophical skill. And I've seen, for example, in the case that I mentioned, I've seen these texts of the medieval philosophers brought to light by people who knew an immense amount about the text, but also were trained as philosophers, and so could make it intelligible. And I've also seen the same kind of thing, for example, well, just to mention a couple of other cases which I've had a little bit of experience of, with both the ancient Indian philosophy and with Islamic philosophy, where again, people who've had that combination of skills were able to bring these texts to life and show that something very philosophically interesting and insightful was going on in them. Whereas I mean, the danger often in the study of traditions like that is that in some cases they're dominated by people who are more interested in the historical and linguistic aspects of the text, and are immensely learned about those aspects, but are not themselves trained to do philosophical thinking. And the effect of that kind of treatment is that they kill the texts as philosophical texts, and so that they, with all the scholarship that they have and all the linguistic skills and so on, if these texts are studied by people who are not, as it were, able to do living philosophy, then they make the texts philosophically dead and really only worth studying from a historical point of view, but not from a philosophical point of view. And as I say, my impression is that the texts that are being killed in that way are in fact texts that can be brought to life, but to bring them to life, you have to have philosophical skills yourself to be able to find a plausible, philosophically coherent interpretation. I think at the moment, even, for example, in the study of ancient Greek philosophy, there's some debate about to what extent one can use contemporary philosophy in studying ancient Greek philosophy, because, of course, when one does that kind of thing, there's a danger of anachronism, of just, as it were, looking at the past through contemporary spectacles and somehow distorting the past texts. But I think that if you try to put all contemporary philosophy aside and just come at these past philosophical texts in a kind of naive way, as it were, forgetting about all your training in philosophy, then if you're not as good a philosopher as the person who originally produced this text, you're quite liable to attribute to them very natural but crude philosophical errors or confusions, which they themselves may have avoided because they had the philosophical skill to do so. And although, as it were, the nature of philosophical skill is not completely timeless, it's also not that it changes out of all recognition all the time. So I think quite a lot of philosophical skill is needed to be a good historian of philosophy. And as I say, this is just to repeat something I've already said, that there is always the potential risk in applying a principle of charity to an ancient text, or just an old text, of anachronism and of projecting recent ways of thinking onto a text to which they're alien. But the relevant kind of precaution is just to be controlled by an awareness of the historical context and attention to the details of the text. So, as it were, if somebody's offering an interpretation of a text which just doesn't engage with the specifics of what's written down there, then that seems like too much of a projection of the present ways of thinking onto the past. But if it makes sense of why the philosopher has written in exactly the way they did, then that's good evidence that the interpretation is correct. And just as it were, this awareness of the historical context and attention to the details of the text, I mean, they don't make philosophical skill redundant. I mean, after all, someone who's aware of the context in which present philosophy is produced, and who's very attentive to the exact words on the page and so on, if they don't have philosophical skill, they're not going to be able to make proper sense of a present philosophical text. And the same applies to philosophical texts of the past. So what I've been arguing is that to be a good historian of philosophy, you have to have a good level of philosophical skill, as well as other kinds of skill. What you may not need too much of is philosophical originality. I mean, you may have to have a bit of originality in order to be able to think of a new interpretation of some problematic ancient text. But it doesn't seem that, as it were, you need to have the ability to come up with new philosophical ideas that are not present in any text that you're familiar with. So as well, there's less of a need for originality, but other kinds of philosophical skills, the kind of involves in assessing the coherence of opposition, are required. So there is that level of connection between skill at doing philosophy and skill at doing the history of philosophy. And the bridge is mainly through the principle of charity in interpretation. But however much one's applying that principle, one still has to distinguish two different questions. One is, what did X say? And the other is what X said true? So that although charity requires us not to attribute complete rubbish to X, it's not so demanding a requirement that we have to interpret what someone is saying always as true. Because, I mean, after all, in general, in interpretation, when we're interpreting other people, we need to apply some level of charity, but it doesn't mean that we then have to think that everything that everybody says is true. Now, there's a kind of philosophical writing which muddles together those two questions, which sort of never clearly distinguishes between the two questions. And this is applied especially when this past, or occasionally present philosopher X is treated as some sort of guru, and certain philosophers attract that kind of treatment more than others. And Kant and Wittgenstein, even within the analytic tradition, are treated somewhat like that. And so by not distinguishing the two questions, the historian of, well, the person doing this kind of exegetical writing is enabled to ignore both the details of the text and hard philosophical objections. So often this kind of philosophical writing is not very closely related to the specifics of the text, but it's also not responsive to the kind of objections that a less sympathetic philosopher might want to make. And so, and typically what happens is if you start pressing questions about what the textual basis for the view is, then the person providing it will just switch to the philosophical question. But if you press them with philosophical objections, then they'll switch back to the textual question of what X said, and so that, as it were, they can, if you present an objection to them which is relevant to the question, what did X say, then they switch to the question, is what X said true? And if you present an objection that is relevant to whether is what X said true, then they switch to the question, what did X say? I mean, I don't think as well there's any intent to deceive here, but I think the muddling together of these two questions makes that kind of confusion easy. And so the result tends to be that it's neither good philosophy nor good history of philosophy. And I mean, something that I want to emphasize very strongly is that there is no philosopher so good that the question, what did X say, and is what X said true, are just, well, we don't really need to make the distinction because it's kind of automatic that if X said it, then it's true. I think one thing that the experience of philosophy over thousands of years has made very clear is that philosophy is an extremely difficult subject. It's, as it were, a subject which is pretty much close to the limits of what human beings are capable of doing, and so there's no disgrace in being wrong sometimes in philosophy, and no philosopher in the history of philosophy has been so great that they were incapable of making mistakes, just as the great natural scientists of the past were often wrong about things, and we certainly shouldn't be treating any philosopher as though they were infallible, and it's not really in the end doing a favor to a philosopher to treat them as a guru or as infallible, because the effect of it is, as it were, to kill the discussion around them philosophically, so that it makes it less likely that their ideas will have a creative and fruitful influence, because we're not allowing their ideas to be questioned. I think it's when we engage in a dialogue with the philosophy of the past that allows us to question the philosophers of the past and to question whether what they're saying is correct, and maybe quite often to come to the conclusion that it wasn't. That we can use their ideas in a constructive way because we're properly engaging in the philosophical questions that they were interested in. I mean, they weren't interested typically in questions of interpretation. They were interested in questions, roughly speaking, about the world. And if we want to continue the work that they started, we should have the same kind of orientation. And that includes, as we're not just accepting what they said as true without question. And so I think it's clear that one should be very clear about whether one's doing philosophy or history of philosophy, whether one's asking a philosophical question that's not about history, or asking a question about the history of those philosophical ideas. I mean, both things are completely legitimate kinds of inquiry, but we should be clear about which question we're asking. Now, so that was all to do with the question of how good a philosopher must you be to be a good historian of philosophy. And now I want to switch to the other question, which is how good a historian of philosophy must you be to be a good philosopher, which is the kind of converse of the question that I was asking about before. And so this is a question which is obviously involved in issues about philosophical education. And of course, in many countries, an education in philosophy is mainly an education in the history of philosophy. And that's so even in probably the majority of countries in continental Europe, as well as outside Europe. This emphasis on the history of philosophy in philosophical education is much less, on the whole, in English-speaking countries, where more of the syllabus is organized by subject area. So epistemology, metaphysics, moral philosophy, political philosophy, philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, and so on. And even within those areas, the organization is, as people sometimes say, is problem-oriented. It's related to questions. Let's say if we were doing metaphysics, it would be related to questions about time or mind and matter or whatever it was. And it's not organized in terms of the history of metaphysics, but by as it were, if you like, non-historical metaphysical questions. I think, not very surprisingly, one area of philosophy in which this historical emphasis is much less is now in the teaching of logic, where in most countries in the world, I think, a logic course is not a course on the history of logic. And that's obviously related to the way in which logic is to some extent similar to mathematics. And of course, education in mathematics is not education in the history of mathematics. Of course, even in English-speaking countries, a significant proportion of the syllabus is spent on the history of philosophy. And it's also the case that some knowledge of the history of philosophy is expected in courses demarcated by subject area, but although it might be quite second-hand knowledge. So, for example, if you're doing a course on moral philosophy, there's likely to be some discussion of Hume's and Kant's views on moral philosophy. And if you're doing a course on the philosophy of language, you're likely to hear about Frege's philosophy of language and Russell's views on philosophy of language, although not in a very sort of historical way, but you still are expected to know what they thought about these matters. But I mean, the reason for that is that in those areas, those particular philosophers' views are still very influential, and they're still, as it were, serious contenders for being at least an approximation to the truth. But also, in almost any course oriented towards analytic philosophy, some parts of very recent, by which I mean roughly speaking post-1960 history of philosophy, are taught. So I think one thing that people in these debates often forget about is that the history of philosophy comes all the way up to the present. And so, when we're talking about philosophers who wrote in the period from 1960 to today, we are, in a way, discussing the history of philosophy. And this would be much more obvious if we were talking about, for example, political events. So, it's perfectly obvious that that if we're talking about events that happened in the period post 1960, then we may be talking about politics, but we're also talking about history. But this kind of where the role of recent history of philosophy often gets forgotten, because of course when history of philosophy is taught as history of philosophy, it tends to be of the history of much earlier philosophy. But to a certain extent, what's at issue is not so much whether the history of philosophy is taught as whether we're teaching the recent history of philosophy or the much older history of philosophy. And in a strange way, there's something rather unhistorical about many defenders of the importance of history of philosophy in philosophical education, in that they fail to take a historical view of recent philosophy. But of course, it does have to be said that the selection of recent philosophy that tends to be taught in courses on metaphysics or epistemology or moral philosophy or whatever it is typically made on grounds of relevance to the current debate, not general historical significance. And there's usually not much attempt to provide a historical overview. But on the other hand, the fact that these texts are being selected on grounds of relevance to a current debate does mean that they are taught in a way which makes them philosophically alive, that as having something to say to us now as philosophers. Whereas if there's no such selection on grounds of relevance to current debate, then the effect is often to, as I mentioned before, to kill the philosophical interest of the material. Now, I mean, if we're just thinking about this in relation to other subjects, well, I've already mentioned that an education in mathematics is not mainly an education in history of mathematics. And of course, this applies to many other subjects. An education in physics is not mainly an education in history of physics. An education in biology is not mainly an education in history of biology. An education in economics is not mainly an education in the history of economics. An education in linguistics is not mainly an education in history of linguistics. Sorry to just keep making the point, but in relation to a whole series of areas. And so if one's thinking about the rationale for this, it's not at all obvious why philosophy should be different from those other subjects: mathematics, physics, biology, economics, linguistics. And in fact, the tendency of these lectures that I've been giving has been to emphasize the similarity in many ways to those other sorts of subject. So, I mean, there's currently a lot of discussion about within particularly English-speaking philosophy, but also maybe the broader analytic tradition, about how broader knowledge of the history of philosophy, including non-Western traditions, might or might not improve contemporary non-historical philosophy. And the kinds of points that are made by historians of philosophy are that if you have a broader knowledge of the history of philosophy, it gives you a wider range of theoretical perspectives to choose from. And it enables you to identify and question current assumptions. And so in principle, studying other traditions than the one that we descend from might serve those purposes a bit better, because maybe there's a better chance of studying work which is more radically different from what we're used to than perhaps, let's say, ancient Greek philosophy. I mean, and so that would apply to some extent to knowledge of philosophy in other contemporary cultures as offering similar advantages. So just exploring what the advantages of history of philosophy are. And another kind of advantage that it has, not just, as it were, suggesting alternatives to us, is that the track record of different attempts over an extended period to make an idea work is often better evidence against that idea than any particular, as it were, one killer objection to a particular version of it. So an example of that, I think, is that the logical positivists, the Vienna Circle and other people with a similar outlook in the 1920s and 30s, had what was called the verification principle, which is, roughly speaking, that any cognitively meaningful sentence is either analytic or inconsistent, or empirically verifiable or falsifiable. I mean, it's an idea which goes back into the further into the empiricist tradition. So Hume had a dichotomy between relations of ideas and matters of fact, and his relations of ideas would correspond to the analytic or inconsistent side, and the matters of fact would correspond to the empirically verifiable or falsifiable side. So the logical positivists put forward this verification principle, and the problem was that when, of course, they were themselves very keen on making the principle precise, because that was part of their own methodology, that something like that should be made as precise as possible. But the trouble was that when they made it precise, it became very easy to find counterexamples to it. Or, I mean, often what happened was that it sort of somehow turned out that everything would pass this test, so that you would end up not being able to rule out anything, and if they made it more demanding, then the problem would be that it ended up ruling out all things like scientific laws or putative scientific laws as cognitively meaningless. So they were not able to find some kind of middle way that avoided those problems. And I think if we were just looking at any one particular version of the principle and a counterexample to that, the counterexample might be decisive against that particular version, but it would be natural to think that that perhaps if you just find some clever way of modifying it, then you could overcome that problem, and you might overcome that particular problem. But and so you might think that, you know, a counterexample to a particular version was not very telling. But I think that this track record of attempts to make it precise, all ending in failure, suggests that there's something much deeper wrong with the idea than just some unfortunate little glitch in a particular attempt to articulate it. So really what we've had is, as it were, a demonstration that some very, very clever and highly motivated people who had every reason to find the best version of this principle while unable to find a good version. And the fact that so much effort went into looking for a correct, precise version of the verification principle, and they all ended in failure. And that the effort went in on the part of people who had every motivation to find it, and that they were very smart. That I think it is quite good evidence, but it's evidence of a historical kind. It's the track record of the idea. You need to know that a lot of people were trying to do this, and that they were smart people, and so on, for the failure to be so significant. Another kind of example that we might give about how the history of philosophy can cast light on contemporary philosophy is in discussion of David Lewis's modal realism, which is his crazy-sounding view that other possible worlds that we use to evaluate counterfactual claims about what would have been the case if things had been different, and so on, and modal claims about what's necessary or possible. But these other possible worlds are just as real as our world. They're just concrete, spatio-temporal, like ours, but causally disconnected from ours, so that there are all these different worlds which are all equally concrete. And David Lewis made very ingenious attempts to argue that although his modal realism sounds crazy, it in fact is consistent with common sense. And I think it's sometimes quite illuminating in these debates to think about the analogy with Bishop Berkeley's subjective idealism, where he was claiming that everything, roughly speaking, is made out of, or everything that we can perceive is made out of ideas, and that there's no matter out there. That all there are different spirits and their ideas. And George Berkeley also claimed that his subjective idealism was completely consistent with common sense. He even thought of it as a way of defending common sense, also, by the way, defending religion against what was then contemporary science, or against certain philosophers who were impressed by it. And so in both cases, we've got a view which, on the one hand, seems pretty crazy and outrageously inconsistent with common sense. And yet we have a philosopher who's very ingeniously arguing that, in fact, they can make sense and reinterpret everything that the common sense person says as consistent with their view. And I think it's often in understanding the dialectic of one, it's useful to think about the other. I mean, my own view is that it's an analogy which works against Lewis's modal realism, because it's pretty clear that Berkeley's subjective idealism really was a very bad idea, however ingenious he was in defending it. But at any rate, even if you don't want to draw that moral from it, I think seeing the structural analogies between the debates, it does illuminate the present one in terms of the past. So, one can make all kinds of cogent points in favor of the importance of the history of philosophy within a philosophy syllabus. But the most important thing to bear in mind is that a philosophy syllabus has limits. There's a limit to how many hours students are going to be taught philosophy for, so that what we're concerned with is a competition for scarce resources of time and energy on the part of both professors and students. And so it's inevitable that the more philosophy of the past is taught, the less philosophy of the present is taught, because we've got these constraints on the syllabus. And we've also got constraints on how the philosophical community, which is of a relatively fixed size, well, maybe not so much in China where things are expanding so much, but in most countries, so that if we have more of one good thing, we have less of another good thing, and so we can't consider these issues without weighing priorities. And I think it's also worth emphasizing that studying the history of philosophy inculcates a different mindset from studying non-historical philosophy. So that the kind of mindset that the history of philosophy gets you into is asking questions of the form, what did such and such a philosopher say, or what did they mean by what they said? Those questions of interpretation, because something that one surely does have to say to students a lot of the time when they're studying the history of philosophy is, well, never mind whether this is true. Let's see what this philosopher meant. I mean, one way in which that comes up quite a lot particularly in, but certainly not only in the West, is that these days many of the students and of their professors are atheists, while the philosophers they're studying believed in the existence of God, and so you have to tell the students, look, all right, we may not believe in God, but this philosopher did, and so we just have to, in making sense of what they're saying, bear that in mind, that they had a theistic worldview which we may not have. Whereas if you're studying non-historical philosophy, you're not going to want to focus on questions about what a certain philosopher said or meant. You're just going to be focused on a question like, well, is it true that God exists? Whoever said it. And so it's not simply that, as it were, you spend a certain number of hours doing one thing and then you spend some remaining number of hours studying another thing. It's also that the kind of question that one kind of study gets you to ask is different from the kind of question that the other kind of study gets you to ask. And so we have to, I mean, bearing that kind of thing in mind, we have to decide how these resources should be allocated and divided between the history of philosophy and non-historical philosophy. And it seems to me that in their efforts to protect their subject, historians of philosophy sometimes exaggerate its potential value for contemporary philosophy. And as a crude indication of that is that influential contributions to contemporary discussion of issues in non-historical philosophy, they rarely come from scholars of the history of philosophy. And I mean, often, even if a new philosophical idea has a much earlier precedent, and there was some past philosopher thought something similar, the idea has to be developed independently in a contemporary setting before the significance of the precedent can be understood in retrospect. So one example of that is what's sometimes called the possible worlds revolution of the 1960s, roughly, where suddenly possible worlds started playing a central role in philosophical discussion within analytic philosophy in the work of Saul Kripke, David Lewis, Robert Stolnaker, and others. And of course, it's absolutely true that there was a past precedent for this, which was the role of possible worlds in Leibniz's philosophy centuries before. And I think all of these philosophers who were invoking possible worlds, but they were perfectly aware that Leibniz had talked about them. And in fact, even earlier in the Rudolf Carnap's work, he preferred to, also on modal logic, he talked about state descriptions, but he was quite aware and mentioned the precedent in Leibniz. But it was not really Leibniz's work that inspired the possible worlds revolution, because after all, the possible worlds revolution could have happened at any time when people were aware of Leibniz's work, because they were for centuries. The possible worlds revolution happened when technical developments in the semantics of modal logic required a very specific role to be played, where the things that played that role were naturally thought of as possible worlds. But that could have happened independently of Leibniz. I don't think Leibniz was needed for that. In fact, I think one of the things that was important was actually an analogy between these possible worlds and times, which is quite different from Leibniz. But so it was rather that once possible worlds were introduced to solve this originally rather technical problem in modal logic, but then a series of philosophers realized how widely they could be applied in exploring philosophical ideas, then people saw the interest of what Leibniz had been doing. But it wasn't because they'd read Leibniz that they came up with these ideas. It was just that they could, in retrospect, see the significance of what Leibniz was talking about. And of course, Leibniz himself didn't know about these kinds of application. I think another example to make the same kind of point concerns the various sorts of paradoxes, like the liar paradox of the person who says, what I'm now saying is not true, and then you have to ask, is what they're saying true? And you get into a contradiction with given standard principles about truth, whether you answer yes or no. And I think once people started thinking seriously about the formal properties of truth and falsity, people like Tarski and so on, these semantic and related epistemic paradoxes became very, very important in modern philosophical logic. And there was certainly a precedent for that. I mean, of course, these paradoxes were first thought of, as far as we know, in ancient Greece, but they were also dealt with in medieval scholastic logic in very sophisticated ways. But it wasn't the medieval discussions that produced this wonderful flowering of work on the semantic paradoxes in contemporary logic. It was the study of formal theories of truth. And then in retrospect, we can see that the medieval scholastic logicians were very sophisticated in their treatment of these paradoxes and had some very interesting things to say about them. But it wasn't because people knew about scholastic logic that the work on the liar and other paradoxes arose. It would have arisen anyway. So it was rather that the contemporary work, motivated by contemporary concerns, enabled us to look back on what the medieval scholastic logicians had been doing and see that it was not some kind of arid logic chopping, but that they were dealing with very, very difficult problems in a very clever way. And a third example, which this is as it were a somewhat self-regarding one, is that if you look in contemporary epistemology at the sort of knowledge-first epistemology that I was advocating or still advocate in Knowledge and Its Limits and elsewhere. So that there's a precedent for that. I mean, if you look at the work of John Cook Wilson, who was a professor in Oxford before the First World War, he definitely had a knowledge-first approach to the mind. I mean, that's pretty explicit in his work, and it is also true that, you know, I'd read a little bit of that when I was an undergraduate, but at the time I didn't think anything of it. And the way I got into knowledge-first epistemology was not a historical way at all. It was through considerations in philosophical logic and considerations about, for example, about the role of knowledge in discrimination and indiscriminability and a whole lot of other clues like that. And it was, although I could see that there was, in retrospect, that there was this historical precedent, the historical precedent wasn't actually, as far as I can see, causally significant. And so I think that often these historical precedents are just things that we see in retrospect. They're not things that have the power to bring about the revolution themselves, because what's needed is for the contemporary philosophy to reach a certain state of development where a certain moves start to make sense, and then the moves are made, whether or not people are thinking about the historical precedents. So just to pull some of these different strands together, my conclusion is this, that studying the history of philosophy is valuable in itself. It's definitely worth doing, but it is definitely something that we want to have in our departments of philosophy. But it is not the highest priority, as different branches of philosophy develop their own distinctive skills and intellectual resources. And that the kinds of question that philosophy most centrally asks, they're not historical questions, and they're more important than the historical questions when it comes to the allocation of resources. So that, for example, the question, what is fairness, is a more important question than the question, what have various past philosophers thought about fairness? And the question, what is knowledge, is a more important question than the question, what have various past philosophers thought about knowledge? And although what the past philosophers have thought is not irrelevant, and they surely some of them had important insights, but what matters most are the sort of distinctive skills and intellectual resources that we have developed and that are still proving useful in thinking about these matters. And in that respect, philosophy is similar to most other disciplines that are able to make some kind of progress. The kind of situation where we may turn to the history of philosophy is where we feel that some part of philosophy has got into a dead end, and that we need to go back before we can go forward. And so, as where we feel that a area of philosophy isn't really going somewhere, one thing that we might do is to look for resources to help it out from the history of philosophy. But in areas where we're actually making some kind of progress, then we don't need to do that. And that the history of philosophy is not going to be our highest priority, although it may well be that the ideas that we're using have developed out of long traditions in the history of philosophy. So in this lecture, we've been talking about some relations between philosophy and history. And in the next lecture, I'm going to discuss relations between philosophy and various other disciplines, not history, because we've talked about that today. And we'll be concerned with questions about what philosophy can learn from other disciplines, and also, of course, potentially what philosophy can teach other disciplines. And I'm going to be emphasizing quite a wide variety of disciplines that, as it were, philosophy has a common boundary or even an overlap with. Thank you very much.
And I'm very honored to be able to say something about this topic. And I find Professor Williamson's lecture very instructive and very clear. And although I think it's very fair to history of philosophy, and in principle, I agree most of what Professor Williamson just said. Still, and I have some my own views and want to share them with you. I think I need to share the screen now. Yeah. Okay. My comments will be in three parts. First, I'll say something in direct response to what Professor Williamson just said, and then I'll give my explanation why history of philosophy is so deemed so important in China and also in many in Europe and in many in the current academic system. And third, I'll say something about despite what Professor Williamson said about the relatively insignificance of history of philosophy to philosophy, we may how the former can still contribute to the later. And first, it is some more direct comments. And the first question is, why are we interested in questions like what did X say instead of what is what X said true? Since this opposition, Professor Williamson has mentioned in his lecture, and that's between the, I think we often talk about it between the merely historical interests and the genuinely philosophical interests. So the first question, which belongs to the history of philosophy, they are interesting, but their interest is merely historical, and only the second one is of some philosophical interest. But I think this opposition is perhaps problematic, because anyone who read a philosophical and classical text, I think he or she will be attracted by the views and the arguments presented in the text. And only after that, because some other reasons, I'll give some other reasons, he will or she will perhaps engage in the historical study of the texts. So, and so I think we cannot, even for the historian of philosophy, almost no one is just interested in the text as a historical architect. Just for example, as a temple of a religion that no longer exists. And actually, this metaphor, I think we can put it more forward in the sense that even the religion does not exist now. I think if we admire a temple, we admire not that because it is a symbol for a once existing religion, but perhaps because it represents some art, some architectonic skill, some human civilization. How older people in the older time and capable of making such a great architect use the skills, and these skills are perhaps still relevant to us. So even in this metaphor, we'll find something living and not simply dead in the temple. So my point is that perhaps there is no just so-called merely historical interests and philosophical interests. Although I think these two questions can somewhat be separated, but not absolutely. And this is the first point. And my second point is the analogy between philosophy and other so-called Geisteswissenschaft in German, or so just like the humanities, so in English. For example, classical literature or art. So Professor Williamson has given us a list of why we just study mathematics or physics or biology or something, but not mainly their history. But we know that in the cases of the so-called Geisteswissenschaften or humanities, when you study English literature or Chinese literature, the main task you take is to study the classical text or works or architects, something like this, or the paintings, anything of this. So and I think the reason is and here too, we cannot simply say that for historical reason or from a historical interest you read this poetry, but not for from a literary or some other interest. You read a classical poetry just not because it not because it is written in the past by a great poet, but because you can have some special aesthetic enjoyment from reading it, and that I think that's quite similar in the case when you read a philosophical text written by kind of Hume or something. Some people like them. So perhaps philosophy is. I mean, many people have said that philosophy is something lies between art and science, including mathematics. So I think I know that Professor Williamson's view is an emphasis the close relation between philosophy and other sciences, including mathematics. But on the other hand, perhaps we should also pay attention to the close relation between philosophy and the arts and so-called Geisteswissenschaft. And the third point is that there's a conclusion drawn from these observations is that the broader cultural function of philosophy is realized mainly by studying the classical texts in the past. I think if you meet some people and say, I'm interested in philosophy, and so perhaps we can, I think this is perhaps not so universally, but for us in China and for many people, if you just begin some philosophical discourse or talks, that's okay. But if you want to know better or go deeper into philosophy, our advice will be, please begin by reading some classical books, and then we discuss them. And this many people take to be the most efficient way if you want to begin a somewhat serious study of philosophy. So this is some quick comments about why the history of philosophy is still important to philosophy. And the second is some explanation why philosophy is so important, why the history of philosophy is so important in many countries for the teaching of philosophy. I think actually and traditionally, I mean between Hegel, there is a strong opposition between philosophy and history. So people contrast between the philosophical and the historical knowledge. The philosophical knowledge is knowledge by reason. They are about the eternal truths, like mathematical truths, or the natural science, which are previously classified onto the broad subject of philosophy, natural philosophy. But historical knowledge only about the contingent and the flexible things, not about the eternal laws. So this opposition is actually is the standard view before Hegel. But why after Hegel there are the historical study of philosophy becomes so prominent? I think for Hegel, he has a so-called metaphysics of Christ, and this something like mind or spirit, untranslatable actually, and we cannot have no time to explain it. But actually, he thinks that philosophy, roughly speaking, is the culminating point of the human geist, of the activities, and so the study of the history of philosophy is the study of the highest achievement of human spirit, something like this. And so he has a peculiar metaphysics, and so he identifies philosophy with its history. And this view, and I should confess, is accepted by very, very few people now, even though by the historians of philosophy, although it's an interesting view, but we normally do not accept it. And actually many people before us did not accept it. Still, they have endeavored to study the history of philosophy. And for example, in the so-called neo-Kantianism, that's the dominant school in Germany in the later 19th century. And the most famous voluminous history of philosophy are written by these people. For example, Windelband and some other Überweg, something like this, some people like this, and they write very extensively on the history of philosophy, but they do not share Hegel's metaphysics. And there are also very complex reasons, but one of the reasons, I think there are two main reasons. First is the professionalization of philosophy, because before Hegel and before Kant, the philosophy is not normally taught in the universities. They are written by Descartes or Hume. Those people are not university professors. And so they do not need to show that, oh, I'm a professional, you are not, so I can write something you cannot. But in the after Hegel, people want to show that I'm an academician, so why I can write something you non-philosopher you cannot. And what justifies my professional status? Because the extensive historical knowledge is one such characteristic. So I think this is one reason why so the first philosophers want to distinguish themselves with other people they just interested in philosophy, and to fulfill the historical details is one reason. But another reason is that I think for the neo-Kantians is that they believe that one way and perhaps the most efficient way of doing philosophy is through a critical study of some important historical figure, most prominently Kant. But they are not dogmatically the disciples of Kant. So I have quoted one sentence from Wilhelm Windelband, that's the most prominent figure of the neo-Kantian school. He said, Kant verstehen heißt ihn hinausgehen. That means to understand Kant means to go beyond Kant. So I think if we study historical text with a critical eye, perhaps that's not a thing. I think that's not a single way, but that might be an efficient way to do philosophy, do some original work in philosophy. And there are some examples in the contemporary analytic philosophy, most notably Peter Strawson's Bound of Sense. So this is something. Perhaps I do not have much time, I think, but I'll give a short comments on the say something on the third point. And I have just quoted a passage from John Rawls' lectures on the history of moral philosophy, which I happened to read recently because I'm just teaching a course on this topic and just a few hours before. And he said that, I read, if we viewed philosophy as specified by a more or less fixed family of problems or questions which might be added on to over time, and if we agreed about the criteria for deciding when these problems are satisfactorily resolved, and if we saw ourselves as making steady progress over time in resolving these problems, then we would have rather little philosophical, but just so-called historical interest in the history of philosophy. But then he questioned these assumptions. So I think these questions are reasonable. So the neo-Kantians, perhaps, they think that there are some perennial problems in philosophy, and Kant has set a paradigm and has given the right direction, although there are many problems still. So if we go through his line and go beyond, we can have some good philosophy. But another view, as Ross thinks that, is that perhaps there are no such perennial problems. And then the study of the history of philosophy is to make us to see what the different set of problems are. And that's about how to about the answer to the question, what is philosophy? The self-understanding of this subject. And then I think if there is no such perennial problems, I think perhaps we should also reflect on our current philosophical vocabulary, because the what is and what is not a philosophical problem is shaped by the vocabularies we used. And perhaps the greatest historical figures, I think their greatness lies most prominently in that they have invented a set of such vocabulary, such as Aristotle, the form, matter, or Kant, the transcendental, the a priori, a posteriori, something analytic, synthetic, something like this. So if we continue their work by paying attention to the vocabulary they used, perhaps we can see something that might be missed in the contemporary philosophical discussions. Perhaps I just one example. Several decades before, we think that epistemology is a so-called normative science discipline. They cannot. It is not an inquiry about the human mind, how it actually works, and it's about purely conceptual analysis. But now, epistemology, people think that perhaps it can have some intersection with cognitive sciences, and this tradition, I think, is revealed to us by the early modern tradition. But of course, there are many progress. So if we see the historical precedent, perhaps we will become more skeptical about the once universally held assumption that philosophical questions are just conceptual, something like this. Perhaps I have said too much, and thank you.
Thank you, Professor Williamson, for the interesting talk, and thanks to Professor Chen for the introduction. As an analytical philosopher, actually, I quite agree with Professor Williamson's view, probably except the point that the history of philosophy might be left to historians rather than philosophers. Considering the philosophical atmosphere in China, I'd like to raise two questions to Professor Williamson. Probably my question wouldn't be as sharp as Lanxin's. Can everyone see my screen?
No.
Yeah.
No?
No.
Okay.
Great.
Okay.
Yes. Okay.
It works now. Okay. So in brief, these two questions are, first, what might be wrong with kind of weak historicism? And the question two is how to defend the so-called ahistorical character of analytical philosophy. Let me explain it. Question one is, suppose we draw a distinction between kind of strong historicism and weak historicism. I think philosophy is a history of philosophy as understood by strong historicists. They might think that there is no distinction between philosophy and the history of philosophy as defended by Hegel. Then there is, of course, arguably untenable, as Williamson explained in the lecture. But however, suppose we understood philosophy is the history of philosophy, we don't take it as its face value, but understood it as a modest historical claim, which emphasizes the importance of history for the understanding of philosophy. Then it looks to me that it does not contradict the claim that philosophy is not a history of philosophy. Furthermore, I think affluence of this kind of weak historicism might argue for two specific claims. First, a meta-philosophical claim, which says the history of philosophy is an essential or constitutive part of philosophy. Of course, in contrast with mathematics and science. And the second claim is it's an epistemic or methodological claim, which says in order to know philosophy, one must know the history of philosophy. Also, in contrast with mathematics and science. I think this kind of weak historicism is stronger than Williamson's view, which holds studying the history of philosophy is valuable for its own sake. I was wondering if Professor Williamson would like to say something about what might be wrong with this kind of weak historicism. And question 2 is how to defend the so-called ahistorical character of analytical philosophy. Analytical philosophy, especially early analytical philosophy, has a character of being ahistorical. Probably Bertrand Russell is an exception. Yeah. As a matter of fact, more and more analytical philosophers have realized how contemporary philosophical ideas and principles are related to the history and the development of society. For example, Professor Williamson mentioned this example, the idea of possible worlds. Yeah. So I suppose some followers of Hegel criticize analytical philosophers by accusing the tendency of forgetting the past, ignoring the historical origins and context of the ideas and doctrines. How should we respond to such critique? Thank you. These are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. So you both raised a number of interesting issues. Responding to Nanxing first. So quite a few of your comments were about the connection between philosophy and the humanities and Geisteswissenschaften and so on. So I'll make a number of individual comments about that. One is on the, as it were, the analogy between great works of philosophy of the past and for example, temples of a now abandoned religion. I mean, you mentioned that the temple, might contain a whole lot of art that we can still appreciate as art, and that it. And we may also be able to understand something about the skill that was used in constructing the temple, and that skill is related to contemporary skills in architecture. I mean, of course, I agree with both of those, and I think at one point in relation to the art in the temple, you suggested that we can read, let's say, Hume as a work of literature, and of course, I mean, he was a very self-conscious stylist, and one can still enjoy Hume's style, even if one disagrees with an awful lot of what he said philosophically. As in fact, I mean, that's my position reading Hume, and the skills in building the temple may also be skills that one can, architectonic skills that one can see in the construction of these philosophical theories of the past, where the way all the different bits fit together and so on. So I mean, I accept those aspects of the analogy, but it is still a very different relation that we have to, let's say, a building like that than to a building that we're still using for its intended purpose. I think the humanities, of course, they cover a variety of things, and one analogy that I made with something that is normally counted as part of the humanities is with between philosophy and linguistics, because linguistics counts as part of the humanities, but studying linguistics does not involve mainly studying the history of linguistics. It involves studying contemporary theories of syntax, semantics, phonetics, and so on. And so I think it's not as though philosophy is completely unlike the rest of the humanities. In relation to the comparison with literature, well, I mean, this goes back to to the fact that one can of course read works of philosophy for their literary style and their construction and so on, but that is a kind of very reduced sort of engagement from what they were written for, and of course, within certain anti-analytic traditions which emphasize the connection between philosophy and literature, they would reject the idea that that literature is fiction, whereas philosophy is not fiction. I mean, even if the philosophy is mistaken, it's still not a fiction. But I take it that it's that when we're engaging with most philosophy as it has been written, I mean, the philosophy is an attempt to say things that are true, and and I think that does lead to a very different type of engagement that we have with works of philosophy than, if we're taking them at all seriously, than we have with works of literature. I mean, of course, people sometimes some works of literature are supposed to embody philosophical ideas in one way or another. But I mean, still, if we're to engage with them philosophically, then we need to, as it were, put them in a form where it's possible to criticize them. On the cultural function of philosophy, I think this does vary from one culture to another. I mean, there's no philosopher for example, in the English-speaking world who occupies the same kind of role that Confucius maybe occupies in Chinese culture. And I mean, I think the cultural function of philosophy can include things like, for example, hospitals now have ethics committees, and those ethics committees, I mean, they evaluate various kinds of, ethically perhaps problematic research, or when there are very difficult questions about, whether to for example, to give a child a blood transfusion when their parents have religious objections to blood transfusions and that kind of thing. And these ethics communities, it used to be that they had some kind of religious person, in Britain, in England, it would be an Anglican clergyman, but now they have an applied ethicist on them typically. And I mean, that's a kind of cultural function of philosophy, which isn't really to do with the history of philosophy, but it is to do with what the philosopher is able to say about a specific practical decision that has to be made. I mean, for example, whether the experiment can go ahead or whether the the child should be given the blood transfusion or whatever. So there was also you also raised the question of doing. I mean, for example, the neo-Kantians who did philosophy by a critical study of Kant, and and as you say, Strawson is doing something a bit like that in the bounds of sense. So, and you suggested that might be the most efficient way of doing philosophy. I mean, that's really what I doubt. I mean, of course, it's not, and I doubt it, as it were, just in the light of how things have gone. I mean, there may have been a time closer to the time of Kant when a critical study of Kant was an efficient way of doing, for example, epistemology and metaphysics. But I don't think that we're any longer living in such a time. I mean, the logic, mathematics, and natural science, have all changed in ways which are would make them completely unrecognizable to Kant. And I think that although we might get something out of the study of Kant, I don't think it's the most efficient way of dealing with the questions. And in the case of Strawson's bounds of sense, it's in fact not been very influential in subsequent metaphysics. I mean, and I think quite a bit of that has to do with the role of transcendental arguments, where I think Strawson is generally thought not to have had very effective responses to the kind of criticisms of the type of transcendental argument that he was using, and so I think in practice, I'm skeptical that the critical study of philosophers so distant in the past from us is in practice the most efficient way of thinking about philosophical problems. Whether those problems are perennial or not, I mean, my own feeling is that, as it were, just in a very, very broad way, they are perennial, because, I mean, questions like, what is justice and what is knowledge? Plato definitely engaged with those questions, and I think people in probably all traditions of philosophy have engaged with them. But of course, they do take very different forms depending on where a given tradition has got to, and I think very often, as it were, it's taken those forms for a reason, that people are asking the questions in the way that makes most sense in their own position, and it's just not clear to me that the most efficient thing to do is to go back to the history of philosophy. There may well be examples where that is exactly the right thing to do, but I think that's not in fact super common in philosophy, that it's the right thing to do. And then just in response to Liu Xiaotao's questions, I wasn't, something I didn't quite get from you, but just to be explicit, I was not suggesting that the history of philosophy should be left to historians. I do think that the history of philosophy mainly needs to be written by philosophers, but perhaps, I mean, I think we're probably agreed on that. So on the weak historicism, so weak historicism was a combination of the metaphilosophical claim that the history of philosophy is an essential or constitutive part of philosophy, and the methodological claim that knowing philosophy requires knowing the history of philosophy. And I think much of this depends on the question, well, how much history of philosophy? And I think you wanted to say that we would, as it were, there was some real bite to weak historicism, because these were, even weak historicism was something that's true of philosophy, but the corresponding thing would not be true of mathematics. But in the case of mathematics, well, as with philosophy, a lot of the history that you need to know is kind of recent history. So one thing that you absolutely do have to know to be a professionally competent mathematician is you have to know a lot about what has been proved so far. I mean, what the current state of mathematics is, what results have been proved, what questions have been answered, and so on, and at least something about what the resources are in other areas, other branches of mathematics in terms of what they've developed. So, I mean, it's actually, if you try to think of a mathematician who's completely ignorant of even the most recent history of mathematics, I think it's very hard to make sense of that. I mean, maybe the closest that we might get to that would be the Ramanujan, the Indian genius, who'd done an incredible amount of mathematics by himself, and then he was brought to Cambridge, and where he worked for the rest of his unfortunately rather short life. But even in his case, he had actually, he'd been given some somewhat elementary textbook which he'd mastered, and then I think he needed to be in Cambridge, as it were, in a way, to learn what the recent history of mathematics was, so that he knew what questions were open, what kinds of standards of proof a solution to a question, to a mathematical problem was supposed to respect, and so on. So that, even in something that looks as ahistorical as mathematics, there is in fact a certain amount of background knowledge of at least the recent history, which is expected for professional competence. And and I think it would be, you could have somebody who had no idea of the broader history of mathematics. I mean, had never heard of Euclid and so on, but who was still able to to do excellent work in some very specific branch of mathematics. But we would kind of regard that person as I think we'd feel that there was something lacking in their mathematical vision because of their total ignorance of the past. And I think it's, although I don't want to say that philosophy is just like mathematics, I don't think it's so different in kind in the case of philosophy. I think, well, certainly, of course, if we're talking about philosophical logic, which is maybe the part of philosophy closest to mathematics, somebody could do a lot of important work in philosophical logic while being very, very ignorant of the history of philosophy. But again, we would feel that there was something missing in them as a philosopher because they didn't have this broader sense of the subject. And I think they're, as in the mathematical case, if we started asking slightly broader questions, that their ignorance would come out. And on the second question, which was about the ahistorical character of analytic philosophy, again, as I've emphasized, it's really, these things are a matter of degree, because analytic philosophy does have a sense of its own past, and and particularly its own recent past, and you can't do it properly if you don't have some knowledge of the recent history and of your area and of such more distant historical figures who are still influential there. So I think when one starts thinking about where philosophy comes from, as I was doing in some of the earlier lectures, and I don't just mean where analytic philosophy comes from, but where any kind of philosophy comes from. I think the kind of curiosity that it comes from is pretty clearly of a non-historical character. I mean, the questions are not historical questions, and the answers that people are wanting to them are not historic. I mean, they don't want to be told something about the history of philosophy. They want to be told something that is relevant directly to the questions that they're asking, like what is justice or what is knowledge, whatever. Of course, it's true that that then if we want to help somebody like that to go deeper into the questions, that we're likely to recommend something to read. But sometimes it may be a classic work, but I think often these days we recommend something that's written fairly recently because it's it will be written in more accessible language, and it won't involve assumptions that may be alien to them. For example, it will be secular rather than assuming, well, as many older books would do, the existence of a Christian God, and I think that's appropriate. I mean, I'm reminded of a novella by Robert Musil called Young Torles, where the central character is an adolescent boy and who at a rather problematic school, but he's taught something about complex numbers. I mean, otherwise no, imaginary numbers, ones which involve the square root of -1. And he finds these very, very puzzling, and he goes to one of his teachers to ask him for some kind of help in understanding what these imaginary numbers are. And his teacher recommends him to read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and there's a wonderful description of how this boy of 16 or something reads the first few pages of the Critique of Pure Reason, and of his complete bewilderment at what he's been given. So that, if he'd been given something a bit more up to date, there were already things at the time that had been written fairly recently, which would actually have given him a more helpful knowledge if he'd been able to master them of imaginary numbers than anything I think he could have got from the Critique of Pure Reason. Yes, but I think it's not. I mean, the ahistorical character of analytic philosophy, it really corresponds to where philosophy comes from, and so I think the onus is on anyone who claims that that philosophy does or must have a historical character, that they need to make the argument that philosophy needs to be so different from the questions that it naturally starts from. I think so. I think that the ahistorical character is actually a quite natural one, and has been, and it is a sort of character that philosophy has had in many different traditions for much of its history. And then just because I didn't make this explicit on the weak historicism, I think my view is roughly this: that if you water down the amount of history of philosophy that is required in the metaphilosophical and methodological claims, if you reduce the amount of history of philosophy being required enough, then weak historicism will be true. But it's also the case for pretty much any intellectual inquiry that some very, very weak historicism is going to be true, because any kind of inquiry it does fundamentally involve some knowledge of where that inquiry has recently been going and how related inquiries are going, so that, as it were, pure ignorance of the past is neither possible nor desirable. And then it's the tricky issues are really just in, as it were, setting the appropriate level of knowledge of the history of philosophy, and in particular, how much it should be knowledge of ancient philosophy and how much knowledge of comparatively recent philosophy. Okay, as usual, there are many more things to be said, but thank you very much again for your good questions.